2020 meeting of the Planning Commission Working Group to order. Ms. Rosario, would you call the roll, please?
Yes. Mr. O'Connor?
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Ms. Leverance?
Here.
Ms. Leverance is an at-large member. Mr. Haldeman?
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. Polster?
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Dr. Rose?
Here.
Dr. Rose represents the Roberts District. Ms. Null?
Here.
Ms. Null represents the Stonehouse District. Mr. Kropp?
Here.
Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District and is chair of the Planning Commission. Ms. Wortman?
Here.
Ms. Wortman represents the Community Participation Team.
Thank you, Ms. Rosario. At this point, because we're doing a virtual meeting, I'd like to cover a resolution item. On April 14th, 2020, the board readopted the Continuity of Government Ordinance, which allows, under certain circumstances, permits this committee to conduct today's meeting by electronic or telephonic means without a quorum of members physically present. May I have a motion for adoption of the resolution for this afternoon's meeting?
Haldeman moves.
Thank you. All those in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Thank you. The resolution passes. Moving on to a discussion about public comment periods. We normally don't allocate public comment periods for PC working group meetings. However, we did afford the public an opportunity to provide input through other means, whether it be the U.S. mail, email, telephone message, or so on. And I'll turn to staff. Have there been any public inputs for this meeting?
This is Tammy. No, we did not receive any for this meeting.
Okay. And before we dig into the agenda, just a couple housekeeping notes. I'm going to, we have a lot to discuss during the next hour and a half, and I'm going to try to watch the time and move things along as efficiently as possible so that every topic gets its own time for discussion. And I also wanted to mention that the purpose of the meeting is really to identify issues that we want to address as the comp plan process moves forward. It's not a problem solution discussion where we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it. It's more to identify issues that the PC working group members think are important and need to be addressed in the comp plan. And by doing it now in May, it gives the other staff agencies an opportunity to start pulling information together in preparation for those discussions. So on that note, I'll turn it back over to Tammy and staff.
Thank you, Mr. Kropp. That was a wonderful introduction, and we appreciate this opportunity to check in with you before we enter into later phases of our comprehensive plan. We had engaged with you before the comprehensive plan process started and gotten some feedback regarding key issues. And I think this is an appropriate point for us to check in again. And thank you for sharing your different ideas up to this point. I want to share with you now a screen of a document that I've put together that just reflects that body of work and just attempts to organize it topic by topic for similar items. I hope that I've captured 100% of thoughts that have been shared up to this point, but please correct me as we go. I'll try and scribe things as best we can. And yes, with that, I'll go ahead and share the screen. This is not an end point. This is just a starting point. So as you can see, I've got 7 topics. So our first topic out of 7 are comments that I had received regarding environmental issues, and several of them are noted here just by way of being efficient, I'll note that we had a desire to entertain more conversation on watershed planning from Mr. Polster. Some items related to equine stocking rate from Mr. Polster. The Lower Chickahominy watershed study, again from Mr. Polster, and flooding and sea level rise from Ms. Leverins. And I'll turn it over to Paul because I know he had some additional comments to make.
I did. Thank you very much, Tammy, members of the working group. Mr. Chairman, good afternoon. Thank you all very much. So I'm just going to put a little bit of a finer point on the process that staff is going to use today to sort of help lead everyone through the meeting. As the chairman noted when we first got started, and as Tammy just echoed, we're going to try to keep the conversation moving. We have 7 main areas, and we've allocated for each of the 7 areas about 10 to 15 minutes. And actually, believe it or not, we're gonna try to end each section with an open-ended question back to you all that will help frame up some of the public input exercises that will be crafted up for later this summer as we go out to the broader general public. So the time allocations we've got set aside for each section, again, Tammy and Ellen and myself are going to try to kind of help keep the conversation focused so that we're stopping about 5 minutes short of those time pieces that we have listed there so that we can save time for that public input piece. So we're a little bit ahead schedule. I'm joined today. We decided to kick it off with the environmental piece because we have the benefit of being joined by Tony Small, our Director of Stormwater and Resource Protection, and Deirdre Wells, our Chief Stormwater Civil Engineer. Mr. Polster had sent in some earlier thoughts about some ideas that he wanted staff to look at in terms of watershed planning. And again, really, as the chair said, the purpose of today really isn't to have staff provide you all with answers or that dialogue sort of back. I want to make sure that the staff team here on our end with Tammy scribing, that our takeaway for today from each of you all is having a really good, clear understanding of what it is you're really looking for us to follow up on, research, bring back more information, and that will, again, potentially ultimately be wrapped up into the technical analyses, the draft chapters, and that staff follows back up. So it's really just more so getting clarity on your requests. And so for the watershed planning piece, Mr. Polster, maybe you can expound just a little bit about what you're looking for. My takeaway from your request is you would like staff to investigate ways that we would maybe have the ability to increase the development criteria, the review criteria by which watersheds are better protected over criteria that may be currently in place. Is that a correct summary of what it is you're looking for watershed planning?
I think it's close, but I think the idea that I'm trying to get at is that we have a very robust process in terms of technically evaluating the results of stormwater and the impacts of impervious surface cover. And the county has done a tremendous job in those technical efforts to include spending money for failures within the development community. And Colonial Heritage is a perfect example where we spent a lot of money with the neighborhood drainage programs to correct those problems. What it does is it fixes the problem in that sub-watershed, but there are impacts that occur downstream into the sub-watershed area. And so I'm looking for a way for us to look at preserving those pristine areas of the county by using watershed zoning as a planning land use tool, in addition to the technical things that we're doing already. The other piece of that I use as an example, which gets to number 3, is that I use that as an example in that we have on the eastern coast, probably the most pristine area and an area that should be preserved. And there was a study that the county has participated in now for 4 years, and all that documentation is there. And so when you look at those subwatershed areas of the Yarmouth and the Gordon area that are in that area, they're somewhere between 0.3% to 4%. And as you move up to the headwaters, you end up getting to this 10 to 25. So I am suggesting that we use watershed zoning and planning and put limitations on the level of impervious surface. Now, that is not in itself like the technical going to solve the problem, which is why in the strategy, I've suggested some of the other land use things and preservation programs that we have. So to get to Tim's point on what are we trying to preserve, if you're going to use PDR dollars, if you're going to use AFD dollars, at least point them to the areas that need the preserving. And so there's a multiple number of strategies that can be used to preserve that piece of the county. We're going to see the same thing happen in the other watersheds, the Diascum that we're going to see where we've got economic development in 2 areas up there, all upstream, that will cause problems downstream. If we have the EO go through in the Hill Pleasant Farm area, with that population increase, it's already at 10%. It will impact down there. And downstream from that is the York River State Park and some other parks there. And they will be impacted unless we can get a hold of not the stop growth, but to preserve the environment in those areas by putting watershed zoning limitations in the subwatersheds. From a policy point of view, I want to see a land use map come out of this thing that it specifies what the current impervious surface levels are, as well as a map that indicates what the levels would stay at with the development. And then the next step is approval by the board. And the next step after that is a zoning ordinance to enforce it. Those are the things that I'm looking to come out of this thing. And it answers the 2 most key things that we've been hearing about for years, that we're not doing enough to preserve the environment at all. That's it.
And so let me follow up again just to make sure that as Tammy is sort of scribing some of these thoughts, it sounds like, so, one idea could be to investigate sort of the map approach and all of that. But, part of what staff will, again, sort of research and develop and see what tools are possible over these next couple of months, sounded like the key thread amongst all of that was the end goal of increasing our ability to protect ecosystems downstream of a particular development site.
That's correct.
Again, I don't want to oversimplify, but I want to try to make sure we put a little bit of a fine point on it.
And that's correct. And if you go back and look at the watershed plans that have been developed since 1998, and then forward to the 215 one with the Skimino York Creek, you'll see those plans specify by subwatershed what they thought were the level of impervious surface at the time, as well as some future predictions. Now, they didn't do that for the Skimino for future, but all the rest of them did. And so you only need to look at what's going on in the Mill Creek and Powhatan and the urbanized areas to realize the amount of money we put into those things and what that means in terms of preserving the downstream areas. Necco Land is a perfect example for the Mill Creek. We put some of that in a PDR program. Some of it's in an AFD. So, there may be other strategies that besides the technical approaches to preserve or protect those subwatersheds.
Okay.
Did anyone from Stormwater want to weigh in, or at this point just keep moving through the environmental?
So the good thing with Tony and Deirdre is we've also got sort of the ability to follow up and do some partner component inputs with the Stormwater Advisory Committee and some of the groups there too. Tony, Deirdre, any other sort of, since you all will be working with us to sort of help look at this over the next couple of months, any other clarity that you might be looking for in terms of the request? Or
this is Tony. Paul, this is Tony. I just wanted to chime in and say Frank and I have talked about this previously, and he's shared some documentation with us that I am now sharing with Deirdre so we can start taking a look at that. and seeing what we can come up with. But I have his supporting documentation that he has been willing to share with us, and that's been great.
Great.
And I see Rob Rose has his hand up for a question.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a question, and maybe it's more for Frank, but the focus here seems to be on impervious surface. And if the overall goal is environmental protection, ecosystem protection, and ecosystem services, could it and should it go beyond just a measure of impervious surface?
My point of view, it's the canary in the mine is all that is. And when you take a look at the strategies that the county has taken for land use policies and supported, there are other environmental things that we're using to protect it. The PDR, for example, as well as the AFD program. And so protecting the amount of forest area and agricultural area helps to preserve that ecology. We've also done stream restorations and bought pieces of property to help those downstream areas within the Yarmouth. So it's a number of things that are occurring, but we've never had a planning tool on land use. Most of our approaches have been technical or voluntary. Even the PDR, we did the PDR program, but what was the point of putting the land in the PDR? What was it preserving? And so all I'm trying to do is put a finer point on one, deciding what it is you're trying to preserve and protect, and then put a set of policies and technical solutions in there to do that.
Again, Jack has his hand up. Jack?
Rob, just to go back to your question, you asked if there are any other indicators besides impervious surface, if I understood you correctly. Do you have any in mind?
Well, I mean, just thinking about ecosystems and thinking about something, and Frank mentioned forests and the importance of recognizing that you are preserving forests as well, and using impervious surface as an indicator of health of the watershed. But there are ways to measure, say, deforestation and forest change. And certainly from an environmental perspective, grasses that are around houses are not the same as standing forests. And so even though neither of those are impervious surface, they're not equal in terms of the environment either.
Yeah, good point. We also measure the ecological condition of our streams from time to time. That could be another indicator.
Mm-hmm.
We do. So this is Paul. So again, not to cut off any great conversation, I want to make sure that we're getting a good takeaway. So, it sounds like part of some next steps for staff could be to sort of help provide some additional background information. A lot of what we do now gets at water quality and water quantity, and a lot of the calculations we use to put in place now factor in some of those sort of pre and post land cover types. And so a lot of those are in place, and we do some bacteriological sampling and some of those things with some other programs that the county does. It sounds like, from what I'm hearing from Mr. Polster's request, is maybe in terms of the water quality and water quantity, there could be an enhanced sort of third layer on a percentage of impervious that helps with, I think what I'm hearing is the ultimate concern is ultimately sedimentation downstream of a development project, because certainly kind of going back to the colonial heritage example, that's been some of the history. You got some erosion and some of those things kind of happening, but a lot of what is referenced there, I think specifically also to the colonial heritage example, is that downstream sedimentation. So we'll look to layer some of that in, and we'll try to get some of those pieces back to you all for sure. If there weren't, I don't see any other hands up right now. I do think, in the interest of time, we have the benefit of not spending a lot of time, if any more, on equine stocking rate. I think the CPT piece on Monday, where we heard the presentation from the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District, was really well put together, and we have those materials and that sort of pre-prepared presentation on file for everybody to re-listen to. Mr. Polster, anybody else, was there anything else you wanted to append to that for the benefit of the larger group today?
Well, just the comment that what we do with stormwater and what Tony's group does is 5% of the total acreage of the county. That's it. That's all she's responsible for. The other 95% falls in with the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District. And so I've been very supportive of this program for the last 3 or 4 years, just simply because we don't do enough for the rest of the land cover in this county. And the only other person that's tasked with that responsibility by regulation are these guys. So this is a great effort to try to do something for the other 95% of the county's acreage.
Sure.
Now, I saw Julie had an item there for sea level rise. Do we want to move on to that one?
Yeah, maybe some clarity for staff on that one could be sort of, is that as it may affect property, or is that similar to Mr. Polster's concern about how that might impact some of our transportation infrastructure?
All of the above. What I'm really looking at is, I remember in North Carolina, I can't remember which hurricane it was, but one town moved, completely relocated as a result of the flooding along a river in North Carolina. So are there areas of our county where we should be looking and working with property owners to find out if this is something that we need to plan for in a very intensive way and figure out ways to keep people safe and keep their property safe, which may include moving them?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Anybody else?
Tammy, I'll let Tammy sort of finish scribing that on the screen. Maybe then, Tammy, I could, if there weren't anything else, I see Dr. Rose's hand raised. After that, maybe we could have Tammy kind of cover the community engagement question she has in mind.
No, actually, I have one more thing to say, and that is that I am so impressed that my comments that came in about 20 minutes before this meeting started actually made it to the presentation. So thank you.
Welcome.
Dr. Rose has his hand up as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think this is a really important issue and ties into the bigger environmental picture. And certainly with sea level rise, this is going to be a critical issue to be looking at. And I hope that as part of this planning, we could be looking at green infrastructure as a way to mitigate some of the impacts of sea level rise. It's sort of there's new thinking around how to mitigate these impacts, and kind of the old method is build a wall, gray infrastructure. But green infrastructure can be really important and really beneficial, not only to protecting the people that live near these potential flood areas, but improving the health and the quality of the environment within James City County.
Frank, you had your hand up as well.
Sorry, let me unmute myself. The thing that I wanted to make sure that we added were 3 points. Is one, the county and Tony's group are doing great things with those sort of soft things that Rob was just talking about. The Chickahominy Riverfront Park is one that got approved for funding that does that. And of course, the example that I use all the time is the Jamestown Beach area, where we've done that work with the guys over in Gloucester. With the VIMS folks. But the other piece that struck me is that for the first time, we have to adjust the comp plan to take sea level rise into place. And I think it's just a little bit more than what the Hampton Roads guys are suggesting in terms of flooding area and those sorts of issues. I believe that the real issue is what are the impacts on the infrastructure, of which the best example I have now is if you take a look at the Colonial Triangle's transportation, they for the first time are using sea level rise and impacted those areas that I pointed out in my message. The piece that I added as an addition that goes to Julia's piece is when you take a look at that one section that I highlighted in my note in Governor's Landing, it will be, that road will disconnect those set of houses over there. So it's not just the issue of houses being flooded and being moved out. There are infrastructure and safety and security issues about that. So I am hoping that we get in that section of the comp plan, we get a good picture of what infrastructure issues in the county could be impacted in some of the other neighborhoods, which may not be county properties. and my governor land is my first example. Chickahominy is the other one. So I want to make sure that that chapter that's going into this comp plan that's required takes into those issues, and specifically the ones in the transportation plan in those areas that we know already.
Okay. Tammy, you want to wrap us up with this section? Yeah, with your question.
I do have some of those issues reflected in the transportation section when we get to it, but this might be a good time to go to our concluding question for this section. Let's see. Okay. What guidance do you need from the community on environment issues to help inform policy direction? As we're putting together our public engagement opportunities for this summer, and then again in the fall, we'd really like some reflection on that to help us draw input from the citizens that will help you when you're grappling with these policy issues.
Frank, is your hand still up, or did you?
No, I raised it again, and to answer her question.
We're just going to keep your hand in blue for the meeting.
All right, here, I'm just going to take it off right now. I've lowered it. But in that preserving the areas of the county, one of the things that I think is an educational issue is when you go back and look at the survey that was done and the online piece, people's ideas of things that they think they would like to see preserved are already preserved. And so what they don't understand, I mean, when you put the Yorktown State Park as something I want to preserve, or the Chickahominy Riverfront Park, or the Jamestown Beach, you know, we have done a lot in those areas in the county. So there's an educational issue. So when we come to this issue of mine of the Chickahominy Riverfront Park, it would be helpful if you could start sharing from the staff's point of view the things that you have been involved with that project, and get them to understand the significance, both economic as well as the environmental piece of preserving the lower Chickahominy. And that would go a long way to rationalizing why people ought to spend money on a PDR program, or why they should continue to spend millions of dollars to support the AFD, so that they can realize that those dollars are preserving the environment, but they don't know about it. So if you want to continue to keep their funding or have their support for those funding, help out with these educational things and use the lower Chickahominy as a use case.
Okay. Julie, I see your hands up. Hello, Julie? Well, while she's coming online, I guess one question.
Off mute. Excuse
Okay,
me.
go ahead.
I'll take myself off mute, sorry. Is water quality and availability part of this section?
Water quality is, and water availability for public water supply is typically in the public facilities section, but we can pull it all in right here.
Okay, because that was probably an area that I should have mentioned in my list, but I'm wondering how much of a concern that is to the public. I know the availability is an issue, but is water quality an issue? Because that would tie right back into the sedimentation and the watersheds.
Can I add a couple of questions too once Tammy catches up? And that is, from public input wise, I'm wondering, insurance liability with sea level rise, is there any support from the public to raise taxes if necessary for damage due to sea level rise, for instance? Or would the public be receptive to the county taking a more aggressive stance on restricting residential or commercial development in certain areas if it looks like they might be impacted by sea level rise? I guess, I know there's some property, we look at wetlands very closely, and I think there's some residential areas that we try to restrict development, but I'm just wondering whether the public would be receptive to a broader approach to restrict that due to sea level rise forecasts.
Did I capture your comment correctly?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
And I see Mr. O'Connor has a hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick comment. We did a bunch of this work, I guess, 2 years ago with Christie Parish and the floodplains. So perhaps we could revisit that in a future meeting just for an educational point.
I'm going to put that on the previous page. Is that okay? More of an issue.
And then I see Ginny has her hand up and Frank as well, but we're also pushing the time limit. So Ginny, why don't we go with you and then maybe close with Frank?
Okay, just very quickly, I'm looking at the survey that was done, the Community Comprehensive Plan Survey that was done in 2019. And one of the items that fell into that big gap area was efforts to protect and improve the natural environment, including water quality, air quality, and environmentally sensitive areas, where 95% of people thought it was important and 80% of people were satisfied. In terms of getting community input, I would think it would be helpful to know more about what they're dissatisfied about. Can we build any details on that lack of satisfaction?
Okay.
That's it.
Good, thanks. Frank, do you have any final thoughts, or do you want to move on to the next topic?
I was going to agree with Tim. It's not only that, but the stormwater guys, and they already have that piece written for the this upcoming comp plan on the sea level rise, is the stuff with the Hampton Roads guys has to do with all the floodplain pieces and the things that they've done, as well as the county has a program right now to help people like in the Chickahominy, where the understory area where there's venting, so if it does flood, the water doesn't push the house up, it pushes out. And they're funding that out of county money to be able to help that. So those sort of details like that, I'm pretty comfortable with in terms of what the stormwater guys are planning to do and have done with all the flood zone stuff.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. This was I think this environmental section was a good discussion, and I think it's a good shopping list moving forward.
Okay, well, moving to housing as the second topic, we had received some input from Mr. Kropp regarding questions about a potential for a housing authority, as well as a comment from Ms. Leverin. So I'll invite you to elaborate or to give me some revisions to incorporate if necessary. Any further discussion?
I think, thank you, Tammy. I think that you captured the main ideas. It's just that, workforce housing and affordable housing has been such a hot button issue in the county for years and years. And I know the city of Williamsburg has a housing authority, and I'd like during the comp plan portion to just get some information on what's involved in a housing authority. Is it beneficial to a jurisdiction to do that? Can it help solve a problem? My understanding is very, very basic of that, but does James City County become a landlord? Does it have to be property that the county owns, something that might be public land right now? Is it a better way to put rent controls in place, and does the county have the staff capability, say through general services, to provide a lot of the maintenance and upkeep? In other words, where does would a housing authority's responsibility end and residents begin? And so it seems like an interesting concept, and I'm wondering, if that could apply to us, or what was unique about Williamsburg that allowed them to do it, but we haven't done that here yet.
Any others?
The idea of an overlay might come out of a housing authority. Let Tammy finish writing.
I'm done. I'm sorry.
Okay. But I'm thinking we've heard a lot about how we need to be proactive with affordable housing from the standpoint of saying, okay, we want it to be near transportation. We want it to be in an area where it's easy to get to from businesses. I think it's appropriate for us to take a stab at, and the land use part of the comprehensive plan is the best place to do that, and doing some kind of an overlay and saying, all right, let's look at the whole county and say, where are areas, whether they're public or private, that would make sense for affordable housing, instead of sitting back and waiting for a developer to come up and say, oh, we'd like to do it here, which may or may not make sense.
Mm-hmm. Jenny, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I went back and looked at the Workforce Housing Task Force report, and I would like to see, there are a number of recommendations in there that are recommendations that the county establish policies in certain areas. And to my knowledge, there has not been work done on what it would take to establish those policies. And I'm wondering if that would be an appropriate topic to include here. Things like policies to support adaptive reuse, something to do with manufactured housing and the mobile home parks, a formal policy on the use of publicly owned land for housing development, voluntary inclusionary housing policy. I mean, and then a housing trust fund. I don't want to see those recommendations that are policy oriented get lost, because housing is such a huge point of interest in all of the feedback that we're getting.
Julie?
Yeah, let's also include accessory buildings, and perhaps expanding the allowability of those.
Right.
And would it be okay to put accessory apartments or accessory units?
Sure.
Okay.
Accessory dwelling units, I guess.
Okay. Any others?
Okay.
If not, we can proceed to the associated question for this. What guidance do you need from the community on housing issues to help inform policy direction? What would you like to hear in future engagement opportunities?
Julie, is your hand still up on this one, or?
No.
Okay. Anybody, any feedback on that?
Rich, it's Tim. I think the kind of guidance we'd like to get is whether people are willing to submit to applications that are comprised completely of affordable housing, or if they want to see it mixed in. So we've had a track record over the years of having 3 to 4% affordable housing inside a community, and then other communities are completely 100% inside the housing opportunity policy. So, and we certainly saw pushback at the Oakland Farm application on that apartment complex. So I think I'd like to better understand that from the community.
Great. Jack, there's several hands up. So Jack was first, and then Ginny, I think, had another comment. But Jack, go ahead.
I'd like to know how much, if any, tax dollars residents would be willing to commit to expanding affordable housing.
Just to clarify, meaning would they be willing to spend more, to pay more in taxes if it would help solve that problem?
Either pay more in taxes or do with less of something else.
Okay.
Yes, one or the other.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Ginny? Looks like Julie then.
I don't know if we should ask a question we already know the answer to, but somehow to get at the question of, would people be willing to solve this problem? Would they prefer, it kind of goes into what Tim said, would they prefer to see all of the affordable housing in one part of the county, or would they be willing to mix it up and have a new affordable housing complex next door to their residential neighborhood?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Sure. I mean, would people be willing to, or would people prefer to sequester all of the affordable housing in certain areas of the county, or would they be willing to mix it up and make this a truly mixed up county where we have residential communities with low density right next to a moderate to high density complex that has affordable housing units in it?
And I see Frank's hand, and that probably would be, Frank will be the last comment on this section, again, because of the time constraints, but go ahead, Frank.
On Ginny's piece of the policy, I'd like to find out from the staff whether or not we're going to have a HOP policy and what the profit conditions are. I mean, as far as I know, we don't have one. We keep on referring to it, but we don't. And so there was a suggestion in that report that we wouldn't have the 80 to 120%. It would just be 30 to 60 and 60 to 80, as I recall. But, you know, we don't even have a policy. So at least the county
putting
honestly
that more in the information category, is that appropriate?
Fine with me. I just want to make sure that the next time I see a land use thing and we get to affordable housing, I don't want to see it referenced again. Either that or have a policy.
And Ms. Leverns, did I capture your comments adequately?
Yeah, as long as you understand what I mean, what I'm getting at is the answer to not in my backyard. We kind of know the answers to that, but if people are faced with a specific question, you know, it might be helpful to find out. I mean, if the county is absolutely opposed to having high density affordable housing next door to their low density residential neighborhood, then we need to take that into account. And people may be more broad-minded than that. Of course, people can say one thing and act on another entirely when the time comes.
Yeah. Okay. Tammy and Paul, if it's all right with you, do you want to move on to the next discussion topic?
Yeah, that would be great. And just sort of a bit of an overarching thing, because I know we're getting through these sections kind of briskly to keep us on time today. You know, if there are commission members, working group members who have just didn't have that one piece or two that we weren't able to fit in, just email it back to staff in the next day or two. I don't want you to think if you don't get it in on this call, we're not going to get it in. But I think a lot of this conversation is going to give everybody the flavor of what it is we're looking for. And, certainly we need to keep today on task. So just email those in if you have a couple additional thoughts that as we move from topic to topic. So thank you.
And if we do wrap with a few minutes to spare, we can always reopen the whole menu and just see if there's any parting ideas that came to someone after the discussion time passed as well. Okay.
Great. Under the economic development section, we'd gotten some feedback from Mr. Kropp regarding public-private partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you care to elaborate.
Thank you. Yes. One of the things I started looking into, and as I said in my email, I have an interest in this topic because Toano is just down the street from me. And in my preliminary discussions with some of the staffers, it seems like right now, James City County really only has a public-private partnership program on properties that the county owns, such as the marina, where Billsburg is located. I know the county provided a lot of financial support or low interest loans or what have you to get the brewery in there. And so what I was wondering was what I'd like to see as a discussion, I guess, at the appropriate point in the comp plan is to see if the county could take a broader or a more proactive approach for certain projects. And in my email, I gave the example of how we grade capital improvement projects. We have the weighted criteria, and we go through those and we discuss them. And I'm just wondering if, even though a private developer might come forward with a proposal, if the scrutiny indicates that, yeah, it's a revenue generator for the county, it could solve a workforce housing issue, it can bring new businesses into the county, should the county take a more proactive approach through the Office of Economic Development, for instance, and whether that approach from OED would be trying to line up investors, working with a developer to line up investors, whether it would be some other type of economic assistance. But I think we might be missing some opportunities in the county if we just look at something very black and white that says, well, if it's not on county property, we really shouldn't get involved. And I know that it's a fine line between providing incentives to a private developer for something and setting a precedent for other developers, which is why I think the whole idea of a vetting process where you weigh the potential benefit to the county could provide the ability to let the county get more involved in a public-private partnership. And I see, let's see, Mr. O'Connor and then Frank.
I just had two comments on that. One is whether or not through the EDA or for the county, we create districts, such as a restaurant district or something along those lines where it becomes a park and walk type place, which would then include shops. So we don't really have that, but we certainly heard from the library application that the county finds those types of park and walk things to be really beneficial to downtown Williamsburg. And I would also include our waterfront properties, whether it's the Jamestown Beach site or the like, and really create an opportunity to have a park and walk type environment for shops and restaurants.
Frank?
No, I just didn't turn the hand off. Nothing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Yeah, and it would also be helpful, I think, to when we get to this section, to research best practices. I mean, I think there are other jurisdictions, whether it be Charlottesville or elsewhere in the state, where there might be models that we could adopt elements of and apply to the county. even things like, I know what was it, an enterprise zone that jurisdictions can compete for with the state, and is there the ability to do something like that on a county level, where there are certain incentives to folks who work, or develop in those zones, and I guess similar to what Tim was talking about with like a restaurant district or what have you, but best practices would be interesting.
Are there any other thoughts or any revisions? I know some of this needs cleanup from what we were discussing, but I'm happy to address it right now.
Jack has a hand up.
I do. A couple of things. I'd like to make it clear in the comprehensive plan, whenever we talk about attracting businesses or jobs, that it's within the context defined by the Business Climate Task Force report. They have very specific criteria in the types of businesses and jobs that we want to attract. And I think and I don't take any issue with them. I think they're good criteria. I would just like somewhere, that a note that says jobs means, or attracting businesses means so and so. I also mentioned last month that I would like to restate the goal of the economic section. I know we're going to wait until after the modeling gets done, but I think it needs reworking. I also think, and I don't know how to do this right now because we're right in the middle of a horrible economic situation, but I think we need to think through the dramatic changes in retailing that have occurred since the last comp plan revision. E-commerce, the amount of online sales reported by the Commerce Department has gone from 6.3% of all retail in 2014, which is the date of our last comprehensive plan, to 16% last year. I read in March, it just shot up to 25%. Of course, the coronavirus played a big hand in that, and it's expected to go much higher now. Looking past that, still, there's going to be terrific changes, I think, in one of the mainstays of our economy. Also, the General Assembly, in its wisdom, sharply increased the minimum wage last month. It's due to go up 30% in January of next year, and in stages, it'll go up 48% 2 years from now. And I wonder how that will affect. It'll certainly be a godsend for poor-paying jobs, but what will the effect be on the businesses that have to pay these much higher wages? Will it encourage those businesses to outsource more labor? Will they rely more on technology? These are questions I have that kind of offshoot of the recent developments. I guess that's it. For me.
I saw Paul had his hand up, and Tim, and maybe those will have to be the last two comments, but go ahead, Paul.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Just Mr. Haldeman, quick clarification as Tammy's refining the notes for our takeaway. For number 3, you had just mentioned a linkage to the Business Climate Task Force. So I wanted just to make sure our takeaway, so that report's a bit dated at this point. It's my thinking that the EDA has subsequently had multiple discussions and maybe updates for their own strategic plan about what sectors they think are most important for the county to pursue in diversifying our job base. So if that's okay, it might be better just to maybe more generally say, let's sync back up to the EDA and discussion about, what the current thinking is on appropriate job generation, if that's okay, if that,
or maybe
that still gets at the intent of your comment. Yeah,
it does. Although I haven't seen it, and shame on me, but couldn't we just say let's have an agreed upon? There are a number of very general references to attracting jobs or attracting new businesses and jobs. They do specify things like technology and so forth, but if we could just agree on a definition of what we mean by attracting, when we say we want to attract new businesses or we want to attract more jobs, what exactly it is we're referring to.
Great, thank you.
Tim? And that'll be the last comment before we move to the input from the public. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks. Just to add on to Mr. Haldeman's point, I think at some point we should talk about education as well. We have a school board who has talked about having 21st century ready graduates, but when we talk about attracting businesses and manufacturing jobs and the like, for any of our kids to get any of these technical skills or to go to the governor's school, we have to send them to Newport News or Hampton. And I just think it's completely inappropriate as a parent of high schoolers. So I think I'd like to see education be discussed in more concrete terms in our GSAs in the process.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay, well, that gets us to our question that we've been trying to conclude with. What guidance do you need from the community on economic development issues to help inform policy direction?
Yes, Rob.
Yeah, I think for me, the question I have is that economic development doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. And so I think from the community, it'd be interesting to see what they think the priorities are in terms of economic development. Is it more strip malls and more dollar stores, or is it other opportunities for economic development that would improve the lives for people in James City County?
Great comment. Thank you. Jack?
I agree. Dr. Rose kind of stole my thunder. I have not exactly the same point, but I keep thinking back to the ill-fated Monticello Shops application from December, where the developer wanted to put in some retail shops on Monticello Avenue that were clearly within the development guidelines of the comprehensive plan and clearly within the zoning ordinance, but ran into, just very, very stiff community opposition. And I'm trying to find the right wording for this, but how do we find out exactly what parts of our comprehensive plan are at odds with residents' wishes? And we had a little bit of that in the Oakland Point application too, not exactly the same thing, but I don't know how to do that, but I was just blown away by all the community opposition to that one application. Small application too. It wasn't even a big one.
Yeah. I get one comment that I had. This is Rich. One comment that I had, and I don't know if it belongs in getting feedback from the public or somewhere else, but I felt for a long time that the county needs to develop a new revenue stream besides hospitality and tourism, essentially, are two biggest ones, I believe. And I'd be curious, to get public input on what other types of economic development, I guess to Dr. Rose's point as well, would be welcome here in the county. And then from the staff standpoint, how do you go about developing something like that, whether it be a technology park where you try to court either medical or research or other facilities. But, I think I personally haven't seen much movement in the line of trying to develop additional revenue streams that are less reactive to economic downturns, for instance. But again, like I said, I don't know if that's how much public input versus if that's belongs on one of the previous pages. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. And Rob, did you still have a comment, or was that it?
Sorry, I left my hand up.
Okay. I feel like a school teacher, but all right. Well, I guess that's it on this topic, Tammy.
Great. Well, the next topic was community character, and I hope I did a decent job summarizing some of the early feedback, but please feel free to expand upon what we have here, Mr. Kropp and Mr. O'Connor specifically, Ms. Leverins.
Okay. I just very briefly, I was impressed with a recent land use case that came through, I think the DRC, where there was a property on my road that was encumbered by a conservation easement. And to make a long story short, that easement was modified and took into account another property across the road. They ended up with less density, but one of the conditions was that they would have a 400-foot setback from the road before they could do any type of development on the property, housing-wise. And it struck me as we are continuously getting pressure from people who want to move into some of our scenic areas. How do we protect those areas? And is that a way to do it, to apply a scenic overlay to certain roadways in the county that just restricts that? And what are the pluses and the pitfalls? Do you need a significant source of revenue or money to buy development rights, even if it's only a 400-foot wide strip? Are there other jurisdictions that do things like this? How can we protect some of our better view sheds? And I'll defer to Tim for his part of the discussion.
Thanks, Rich. I'm just very concerned that I think everybody looks at Forge Road as sort of being the idyllic rural lands picture. And if we don't think in terms of a cluster overlay or some sort of long-term plan for that, we could easily see solar farms go in. We could see a few other pieces. There's transmission lines that run right through the heart of Forge Road. And so it's not a hard press to say that, that property would be located. I know a couple of the large landowners, and they've been talking about solar farms for as long as I've known them, which is 10 years or more. So I just think collectively places like Forge Road and other parts of the county, whether it's Croker or other parts, that we clearly define what we want to protect and employ a strategy to do that.
Rob?
Yeah, I just have maybe an overarching comment, and I apologize if I'm complicating things, but it seems like this issue of community character fits in with almost every other topic we've discussed. And it's almost like you want to define what the public thinks of the character of James City County and then address that through economic development and environmental protection. And so I'm curious how you look at these interacting as opposed to separate issues.
Rich, if I might just add one other piece. For most of you know, I'm not a big fan of PDR. I much prefer to see a transfer of development rights, but we can't have both programs in place. So I would think it's really incumbent upon the county, if we're going to employ a PDR program, that we have really rigorous guidelines. Recently at a Board of Supervisors meeting, somebody who lived on Bushneck Road was advocating for PDR because that's his retirement plan for his kids. You know, I think if we're going to employ either a bond or tax money, then we need to have a tangible, measurable public benefit and not spend that money on pieces outside of the PSA that are in no danger of being developed. And to take it a step further, I might even suggest that, you know, there be public hearings for PDR applications so the taxpayers have an opportunity to opine.
Julie?
I think that's a great idea, what Tim just said about public hearings, to make sure this is something will benefit the entire county. But more importantly, I think it's way past time for us to get our arms around all of the various land conservation tools. I mean, do we have areas that are in an AFD that are also in a conservation area, Chesapeake Bay or whatever? And does it make sense to have these in both? I mean, what is it that defines each different kind of tool? And where can they best be applied so they don't overlap? Or if they do overlap, we clearly understand why and how that's to everybody's benefit.
Great comment. Good. Yeah. And I do agree with the reference Tim made in passing to making sure that any land that is looked at for a PDR or conservation effort, that we do a vetting, and again, some sort of an evaluation or a weighted scoring process to determine whether the property is under threat of development 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, as opposed to just whoever gets to the table first or has the most clout. But and then I see
my hand went up again.
Oh, okay, Julie.
This might be another place where it would make a lot of sense for us to be proactive and define an overlay area for the whole county. Where we ahead of time target areas that say, yeah, this is an area that we want to keep an eye on, and we want to make sure that we apply whatever appropriate land conservation tools would be amenable to protecting this area.
Okay. Thank you. And I think time-wise, I see Frank, if you could make a quick comment, and then we'll have Tammy go to the community feedback question.
Not to beat a dead horse, but the whole idea of the whole Chickahominy thing was to focus the idea if that is something that people want to preserve. And whether it's from development or not, it's the issue of how you apply those strategies that Julia just talked about, because there are a number of tools that can be used. But you ought to decide what it is you want to preserve and get to the question of is that really essentially to the character of the county?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Tammy, when you've caught up with that, if you want to roll to the community question.
Certainly. So what guidance, again, do you need from the community on community character issues to really help inform policy direction? Could they help you answer?
Okay. Julie?
Well, I think we've had the same question in a previous one, which is, would the citizens be willing to pay more in taxes or allocate their the county's tax money differently to preserve
Mm-hmm. Or support a bond referendum again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it would be, sorry to jump in, but I think it would be helpful to make sure we understand what the expectations are, whether they're view sheds, as Rich referenced, on Forge Road or out that you see at Whitehall, or if it's really preserving large expanses of farmland that are immediately adjacent to Route 60.
Jenny. Jenny, did you have your hand up?
Any other questions?
Is Jenny Workman there?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry. My network bombed out on me for a little while, so I'm back again. Going back to a point that was made earlier about education, and a point I made about the survey that was done in 2019, efforts to protect and preserve the county's rural character was one of those big gap areas. And I wonder whether we can get from the community more detail about what did they mean by that, and how much do people really know about what's been done, and how accurate is that? And then if it is accurate, what more do they want to see done? This, because we don't get the detail from the survey of what has driven these gaps in satisfaction.
Good point. Good point. And I think we're pushing the time, so we should probably.
Let me just add on Tim's point, and it's a point I made before. When you look at the survey results about what people want to preserve, and you see what they say they want to preserve, and then you go and look at the county's programs of what they have preserved, either through open space, green space, PDR, or the park systems that the community has put together. You have to ask yourself that when Tim says we ought to have some criteria and we ought to decide what those things are, is we do have a number of programs, but they're not connected to an end. We treat them as individual pieces. You go to the PDR guy, you go to the AFD guy, you go to the green space, you go to this or that, but nobody ever looks at all of those things together, which is what I thought Tammy was supposed to do for us from here on out.
All right, thank you, Frank.
Put all these programs together.
Okay. And we need to move. The next topic is going to be transportation. So we do need to, because we have a couple more yet to hit. So.
There are several noted already. In the interest of time, we could just think about any new ones to add to this list, or if modifications are necessary, please let me know.
Okay. Frank, did you want to elaborate on any of the points listed for you on that?
Well, what was interesting was this urban development area that I think all of us want to hear about, because Tohanna is one of those areas. The Barnesville is one of those areas. And the interesting thing about them is they have place types associated with them with the mixed use pieces. Mm-hmm. And so all I'm trying to do is understand between this program, what the county has designated in those areas, and what we're going to do in the modeling. What's the connection, if at all?
Good point. Good point.
Okay.
All right.
Well, if we feel like we have transportation adequately covered with these notes, we can move on to the question.
The last thing I wanted to say on the Rochambeau is we need an alternative to 60 to the upper end of the county. And right now people are using the Route 30 from Whitehall and then going down to the Kmart and that area on Rochambeau. And that section of the road is narrow and dangerous. And so all I'm saying is we ought to fix a back door that's already established. And we saw this in one of the community hearings where the guy didn't realize how much the traffic had increased on that section.
We have hands up from, in this order, Jack, Ginny, and Rob. So Jack Haldeman, do you want to kick off?
Frank already touched on the traffic problem on Route 60, and we saw that when we had the Oakland Point application, and it's unmitigatable. I think in that case and in the case of Monticello, which are two major arteries that are nearing capacity, and maybe in some cases exceeding it, what land use policies do we need to address those? I mean, we can't widen Monticello and we can't widen Route 60. And some of the mitigation, putting in turn lanes and stuff like that have already been done. So that's behind us. And the only thing that's left is land use policies and the land use map to address the volume of traffic on those two critical routes.
Thank you, Jack. Ginny?
Just 2 points. One has to do with the presentations we heard the other day about bike lanes and the need for alternate transportation to cars. And in that connection, we hear a lot about, the new trend is for walkability and small walkable communities and sidewalks. And I'm wondering if that is something that really will be popular here. What are the age demographics for that kind of community? And does it fit with projections that our area might actually be getting older rather than younger? How do those the need for walkability and alternate forms of transportation fit in with the population projections and development, housing development issues?
Okay, thank you. Rob?
Oh, I lowered my hand because Ginny basically said what I was going to say.
Oh, good. Okay. And then, and this will have to be the last comment. I saw Tim had a hand up, but then we're going to have to move on to the next step on transportation. Go ahead, Tim.
I guess it's more of an editorial, but perhaps it'll help us in shaping our GSAs as we go through this. But to the comment about Rochambeau and Route 60, we shot ourselves in the foot for the near term because we approved that solar farm in Hill Pleasant Farm, which would have been a parallel route to take some of the pressure off of Route 60 through the Lightfoot area down to Norwich. So, I think I just use that as an advisement that we need to be really strong in how we word our GSAs moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. I'm just looking at the time. It's 5:20, and we still have a little ways to go. We can go past 5:30.
Rich, can I say one quick thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
What about electric cars? Do we need to plan for that? Just want to throw that in real quick.
Yep, good question. Mm-hmm.
Not electric, self-drive.
Yeah.
Yeah, self-drive.
Oh, so self-drive. Well, and electric in a sense.
Electric should be included in the introduction of electric cars.
Okay. All righty.
So that brings us to our closing question. What guidance do you want to get from the public on transportation issues?
I think it would be helpful to know where people anecdotally find the bottlenecks and the issues. I mean, we all see VDOT reports with level of service, but sometimes it doesn't always equate to the pain points that the citizens feel.
Anybody else? All right.
I would just add, I think it comes out in the questions posed above, but the issue of alternative transportations and modes of transportation, what are people thinking about in terms of walkability, bikeability, public transport, what's missing now, and where improvements can be made?
Good point.
Any others?
Julie?
Yes. I'd also like to add golf carts and scooters and plug-ins for electric cars. Is that something that people are going to want when they go shopping?
Golf cart, scooters. Were there a few other examples?
And electric recharging stations in parking lots.
All right.
If there's nobody
Anything
else.
All right, great. So our next topic is land use. Before we get to more of a miscellaneous category, and there were quite a number of comments here, and wondering if there's any need to expand any of those or new ones.
Frank.
This is my first one there, but it's also a piggyback on Tim's comment, is if you take a look at that corridor study, the levels of service between now and if it was built and if it wasn't built for the congestion levels of service for Croker, Richmond Road, and Lightfoot was no difference. That road wouldn't have changed a thing, Tim, period. However, putting all this new population and development, both on the York County side that we've seen taking place and will continue, if we don't take out that piece of property out of the EO so it won't end up in the PSA, that's a mitigation strategy. But if you continue to keep it in there, you'll have higher levels of congestion with no way to mitigate it, given the corridor study that was done by the Hampton Roads guys. So take it out. That's why I want to see in the modeling in or out and what the differences in the impacts are. So let the data show what it'll show. But it has to also consider the adjacent Yorktown TAZs.
Jack?
Yeah, I agree with Frank. One of the appeals to me of that solar farm at Hill Pleasant Farm was specifically to cut off the Moortown Road extension. It's my conviction that widening roads or building new roads does not solve long-term traffic problems. It exacerbates them. We'll pay a severe price for widening I-64 at some point. We started off with Route 60, and then we added 143, and then we widened 143, and then we put in 64, and then we widened 64, and it's never enough. And there are some points of Interstate 95 south of DC that are 12 lanes wide now, and it's not enough. It'll never be enough. And all you do is push back the frontiers of development when you do that. And so I'm very much in favor of taking the Hill Pleasant Farm out of the EO designation and permanently taking the Moortown Road extension out also, at least all the way, at least as it goes all the way to Croker Road. I also had, excuse me, I got to turn to my notes here for a second, but I also had some issues with the Barhamsville. I'm sorry. Why don't you go to somebody else and I'll come back?
Okay. Let's see. Yours is the only hand up, Jack.
Oh, here we go. I found it. That was convenient. From the Barnesville EO, I would like to respectfully removing residential and childcare under permitted uses in the zoning ordinance and strike from the use list adult daycare centers, nursing homes, group quarters, multifamily housing, community and recreational facilities, health clubs, photography, public billiards, and so forth, places of public assembly, rental of rooms, and retail and service stores. It's right on an interchange, and this is related to what I said before. It's right on an interchange of I-64. It's a perfect location for offices and light industry, a tech center, that sort of thing. But anything else is just going to create more traffic. In the case of making that a residential area or even partially a residential area, you'll have more people living in James City County and jumping on the interstate and heading for Richmond to work. And so that was another suggestion I had. I would also like to redesignate some portion of the general industry area in Grove to permit workforce housing and to support a grocery store. Even to the extent where we would subsidize the grocery store. It's the one area in James City County that is in desperate need of one. It would partially resolve a traffic problem. It would generate, I think, better, more industry locating in that area, having some workforce housing and more of a community there. So that's it. Those are the two things I had, three things.
Okay. Thank you, Jack. Frank.
Sorry, could I just get some additional clarification? Were you saying trying to promote more workforce housing and economic development in the Grove area through changes in land uses?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Specifically in the general industry land use area.
Okay. Frank had his hand up.
Yeah, to piggyback on Jack's piece on the Barnesville, but it's also the Anderson Corner piece also, is when the model takes a look at it, and it goes to the UDA piece that I asked about, you had them coded as mixed use areas that have a lot of those things in there that Jack just talked about taking out. And so I'd like to be able to see what the model says for both the Barnesville and the Anderson about what they business as usual, which is what it's zoned for right now with that place type. And then one that says you don't put those sort of things in there, but you limit it to the pieces that Jack just talked about. So it's a changing in the wording of what we expected in those two EOs that are in the current comprehensive plan, so that we limit the sort of population development that he's talking about with restricting those housing pieces in there.
Thanks, Frank. Good point. Anyone else?
It's Tim. I would just say by limiting housing opportunities, you eliminate the walk to work environment that gets supported by alternative transportation. So, we can't look at these in a vacuum, because York County is going to continue to develop, and it's going to continue to have a negative effect on the roads in James City County. So.
Okay. Any other thoughts for land use? If
Go ahead, Tammy. I was just going to say, since it's 5:30, why don't we move to the community question and then give a little time for a wrap up before a short break.
What guidance do you need from the community on land use issues to help inform policy direction? You guys have done really well with some of the other sections, coming up with thoughtful ideas.
I've got one, Tammy, is on the Hill Pleasant Farm, Moortown. I'd like to hear from the community on what they think about continuing to keep it out of the PSA, keeping it in the rural agricultural area as opposed to developing it. I'd like to hear what they have to say.
Okay. Julie?
I'd like to find out if the community is supportive of the county extending utilities to the Barhamsville interchange.
Now, do you mean strictly the utility issue, or also it's?
Well, it's
you mean
if we try to extend the PSA out there, we're going to inevitably we're going to be opening it up for people to say, well, if you're running right down Richmond Road, why don't you let me be in the PSA too? So
well, it's there with Stonehouse, so it's already been extended out there.
Okay, and that's not in the PSA, so there's a precedent for that. But yeah, so spending county resources to prepare an economic opportunity zone at Barhamsville interchange.
Frank?
Well, correct me, but the Barnesville EO is in the PSA. That's the Hazelwood Farm, and it's also the Taylor Farm at the Anderson Kearney. The issue is that in order for them to develop it, they would have to spend $1 million to extend from the Stonehouse industrial area, the sewer and water up to their area, and that's on them. So the issue is, do we incentivize that area and get affordable housing up there, or a grocery store, so that we make sure we don't end up with another Moortown, or not Moortown, but
Monticello. Mm-hmm. Okay. And Ginny, I saw you had your hand up as well.
Sorry, right. I'm just kind of building on what Julie was saying. I wonder, do we know whether the community supports expansion of the PSA, or they want to leave it as it is? Is that something that we need community input, or do we know the answer already? And if they want to expand it, where?
And along those lines, I don't know how big an effort it is, but what the concept of redrawing the PSA, there's certain areas that are within the public service area that have not been developed. They were selected because it was anticipated that something would happen there, and there's other areas where there's greater pressure. So at some point, what's involved with re-examining the PSA line based on how development patterns have taken place since that was drawn, and is that even doable? Is it sort of one of those things where you just have to make adjustments to it rather than redrawing it?
I like that idea. People, the opportunity to shrink it in places might be out there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is Julie. I didn't get a chance to raise my hand, but what about the idea of raising the density or lowering the density for agricultural lands? That's something that's been kicked around periodically, and just see what people say. We might think we already know the answer, but it's one way to preserve the rural character of these rural lands.
Okay.
Or reductions in density?
Yeah, for rural lands.
Frank, did you have a?
Well, yeah, it's a question for Tammy and Perfall. I thought one of the deliverables underneath your contract and your RFP was the question on the PSA, on whether to extend it or not, or keep it the way. Am I incorrect about that?
May have to get back to you on some of the more subtle details. I think a lot of the work is trying to understand some of the fiscal implications versus a normative, is it right or wrong or where type of thing. I do think that's more appropriately put towards sort of the public forums side of it. But let me chat with Tammy offline, and if we need to follow up with a more specific response in a follow-up, we will.
And at this point, in just a couple of minutes, are there any burning issues that we either didn't address or that, oh, I'm sorry, we probably forgot the community question. Go ahead, Tammy. Anything else on that?
Can I just make one other point? And this may have been, this is Jenny, may have been done when I was offline. We've gotten mixed feedback about mixed use and mixed density developments. And I'm wondering whether that is something we need to get more community preference information on.
Okay.
Sorry if that was covered somewhere else.
No, it's always good to get it down, and we could always scrub it later on if it's a duplicate. Then in the next 2 or 3 minutes, any other issues tying into the slide that's up there right now? Okay. All right. Going once.
I'm not sure we can have a community input on proffers versus impact fees because there's such a high education component to that question. I think that's more of a question for staff.
Okay.
Won't our modeling address some of that?
It should be able to come up with the cumulative impact data that we'll be able to use going forward.
I think it's going to come up with some of the costs. I'm not sure it's going to get to sort of, proffer recommendations, but, again, maybe some more of the subtlety there.
And a lot of that has to do with the what the state will allow us to do.
Okay, did I capture that sufficiently?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. That concludes really, this portion of the agenda, and I can go back and share.
I think Rob had to drop off. Well, I don't know. From my standpoint, I thought this was very helpful. This was, we set this up based on conversations with the other working group members about issues that they wanted to make sure were addressed as this comp plan moved forward. And I personally thought this was a very productive session. I appreciate everybody who submitted inputs and topics beforehand, as well as the comments made during the meeting. I think this was very helpful to me anyway. And thank you all for your participation. And
Rich, before you leave, did I miss the Airbnb issue? Was there any discussion about that? We've talked about it at planning commission meetings several times.
It was on one of Tim's talking points.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it was identified. Yep.
Frank, I just thought I'd stay away from it for tonight. So
yeah, we'll be talking about that in about 20 minutes or so. But Tammy, Paul, do either of you have any closing comments before I ask for a motion?
I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity and for your participation. I think we're always impressed by your level of engagement, and I think that also has been shared with us from others outside of our community. And so we will take this opportunity to incorporate your feedback into the work we're doing to get ready for the deeper dives into each of the comprehensive plan sections and the modeling work that we're doing.
I concur. Thank you all very, very much. Again, you always, all of you always provide such terrific insight and thought-provoking questions. To the degree that the feedback that we got actually may have an answer, well, we're going to do our best to get those to you. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Paul and Tammy, for putting this together. Tammy, I know you were the architect for all this, so thank you. And at this point, I'd like a motion for the Planning Commission to adjourn to the 6 p.m. regular meeting of the Planning Commission.
This is Julie, so move.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Good. Now, technical question, Alex, do we just stay on this link? We don't have to